Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started right away because there's another event that Caroline needs to be at. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lauren Riga, and I am a PhD student here at the Climate Energy College, filling in for Malte this morning. Before we get started, let's acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. Thank you very much. Today's seminar topic is on the circular economy and redesigning our future. And we're very fortunate to have Caroline Lambert here. And she is the European Union's Climate and Energy Counselor for Australia and has a very rich background in energy, climate change, and environmental affairs. So with that said, we'll just go ahead and get started right away. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you for coming. Good morning. So today I'd like to present why the circular economy vision for that we have for the European Union is actually also very good for climate action, even though it was a bit inadvertently that we realized this in the process of designing our circular economy vision. In fact, what we've been focusing on so far in the European Union with regard to climate policy, as is the case in most countries throughout the world, is going towards renewable energies and boosting our energy efficiency. Now, it's very crucial that when it comes to emissions from industrial processes, it doesn't help us that much. And the thing is, if we manage to have all our energy free of carbon, and then also have transport free of carbon and housing free of carbon thanks to electrifying, then emissions from industrial processes end up being quite a large share of the leftover emissions. In 2050 for the European Union, the leftover from industrial emissions is 25% of our total emissions. So it's a rather big problem. And the thing is, totally 100% renewable energy doesn't help us much for the main industrial processes. So this slide is taken from Material Economics, a report that was published last month in the European Union, and the report focuses on the four main industrial processes that create emissions in the European Union. 2/3 of industrial emissions come from making steel, plastics, aluminium, and cement. And this slide shows what is the potential for mitigation by switching to totally low carbon energy for those processes. So you see, you only go down from 918 million tons to 649 million tons. So we're not getting really where we want to be by only focusing on energy. Now, the thing is, so far in the European Union, when it comes to dealing with these leftover emissions, we focus on the supply side. What can we do about making the industrial process more efficient? Can we change the fuel that's at the heart of the chemical process? Can we do CCS? We haven't really looked at the demand side, and that's what the circular economy allows us to do. Where shall I?
This lot don't share, so we're just trying to get that.
Well, what the next slide shows is that if you are using recyclates from these four materials rather than producing them from scratch, we can decrease emissions by over 50% by 2050. And it's really time that we focus on the demand side. I'll continue. Yeah, works now. So this is the amount of emissions you are emitting if you are producing these materials from scratch. And the second bar is the amount of emissions you get if you are using recyclates. So it's pretty major. And what you need to do to decrease these emissions, really in terms of action, go into three main categories. The first is to recirculate the material. To have good recirculation of the material, you need to make sure that you have the right kind of scrap, actually, because producers will only take the recyclates to input the recyclates in a new loop if that's the right quality. For steel, it means that you need to take care not to mix it with copper too much. That's the one critical thing with steel. With aluminum, it's also about different kinds of alloys. You want to limit the numbers of different alloys that you have in aluminum so that you have consistent quality scrap aluminum. For plastic, it's about chemical substances that end up mixed in with the plastics, which limits then what you can do with the recyclate because it could be harmful for certain uses. And there's also sorts of issues with cement, actually. But the key is that you will manage to get recirculation of the material only if you design the product right from the first, and if you disassemble the product in a clean way. And so that's really what we are going to focus on in the European Union, as you'll see from the next slides. What you can also do with design is design more smartly and be more efficient in the construction process. For buildings, for example, 15% of the materials are wasted at the construction site, just because too much has been ordered, or some of it is misused while it's constructed. So that's 50%, that average waste on a construction site. For buildings, again, we tend to overbuild 100% in terms of steel compared to specifications. And that's throughout the world, but apparently happens for new buildings made out of steel. And we could really decrease the amount of steel we put in there. In particular, if we are using high strength steel, which allows us to decrease the amount of steel by 30% compared to specifications. And of course, there is the new circular business model that's about the sharing and the collaborative economy. The average car in the European Union is used 2% of the time, the average office 40% of the time. Now, for some people, owning a car would be a pleasure in itself, and they will always want to own a car. For other people, it's just a way of going from point A to point B. And for these people, actually sharing a car means savings of 75% of materials for the same amount of mobility. And it's an extremely efficient way of moving towards cleaner vehicles, quicker at a lower cost, because of course the costs increase, you can recuperate over a longer, longer distance and a lot more miles. So that this is the snapshot that needs to be done, and that allows us to bring the total amount of emissions that we have now for industrial sector, to cut it by half through demand side measures, and then by again a third through the supply side measures that include CCS. And we have that remaining share of emissions from industrial sectors that's a lot more compatible. It's not perfect, but it's a lot more compatible with having an industrial base that is on the way to a low carbon economy. Now, we, despite what you see from my boss's Twitter feeds these days, the shift towards a circular economy in the European Union was never really a long-held policy dream. It came about more as a unplanned pregnancy type of situation. Now they're all very, very happy about the news. What happened was that all of our waste policy legislation was up for review in 2014, and it was just not the right time, because their mandate was up for renewal at the end of the year. We had the European Parliament election. Our economy wasn't going so well. And you don't really want to talk about intrusive legislation such as waste management that goes from the European level to the local government just before the European election, when you are going to start talks about red tape and green tape from Brussels. Of course, this is a totally unfair characterization of our policies, but that's what happens. And so they were not happy about the news. It was just that it was not the right time. But they did the right thing, and they waited until after the European elections, July, and they tabled a package that was called Towards Zero Waste. The first thing that the new flock of commissioners did when they were appointed was to withdraw the package, saying, well, this is not well balanced between the environment and the economic objectives. We really need to rethink that. And that got all the people in the environment department of the European Commission really worried, because when you hear the not right balance between the economy and environment, you get worried. But in fact, they shouldn't have. And just a year after they said they needed a year to come back with something else, the commissioners tabled a new package with exactly the same waste legislative proposals in there. This time it was called the Circular Economy Package. And it was a political hit from the start. Since then, we managed to have the waste management proposal that were tabled actually legislated, and they're entering into force next week. Less than 2.5 years is actually quite good for European legislation that evolves, EU to local government. And we were also able to table a special package on plastics, and including single-use plastics, just 2 months ago. So how did they do it, turn this thing around? Well, they changed the method. They decided it was a whole of economy approach, and this couldn't be done by the environment department alone. We had to work with the industry department, the climate department, the research department, etc., etc. And they created a big workforce and really made it a whole of economy approach. The package is a policy mammoth. There's over 50 measures in there, so I won't be able to present to you all the measures, but I'll explain the most salient point and how we design the process. So the overall thinking at the start was not about decreasing emissions from materials. As I started this presentation, it was about we are reaching planetary boundaries. We are collectively using each year 1.7 Earth, so we are using up resources 70% faster than when the Earth can renew in a year. We are thus borrowing from future generations. We are living beyond our needs. And we're doing that at a moment where when in the next 12 years, we're going to have a couple more billion people accessing middle class status with the associated consumption patterns. And this is going to put a lot of stress on water use, producing energy, just materials and food in particular. And that is going to create security issues throughout the world in terms of access of material. And in the European Union, we are particularly resource poor, and that poses us a real problem. We are importing 90% of our oil, 70% of our gas, 50% of our coal. We're sending abroad €1 billion a day on our fossil fuel addiction, and our material addiction is about €1.5 billion a day as well. We don't have much on the European Union soil. We have created that critical raw material list in 2011, where we had at that time about 11 materials on that list. Critical raw materials means the ones that we don't have on European soil, and we have to source from abroad in countries that are either not safe in terms of regular source of supply, or just because there's not many countries to source that from. So we had about 14 resources, raw materials listed that critical in 2011, and we had 27 listed as critical last year. And the next list is being done, and there's over 30 materials. So the thing, sourcing this for us is becoming a bigger problem. And yet what we were doing then, until the circular economy package about this dependence, we were mainly doing resource efficiency. And what finally struck my colleagues working with this new horizontal method was that resource efficiency wasn't getting us anywhere. We would buy time, but we would still end up using up resources. And what we needed to do was to reuse and change the whole economic system so that we wouldn't transform. We would go away from that linear economy model where we take precious, scarce, expensive resources, make products out of them, use the products, reject the products, including the materials in them, and transform the resources into something that's worthless and useless. We need to go away from that model to go to this one, where we pay attention from the production stage, from the start, as to how the product is done so that the materials throughout the use cycle don't lose their value, and so that there's enough appetite in a capital markets economy from the private sector to pick up the resource and inject them in a new loop. Now, this is not easily done, hence the 50 measures that we have tabled, but it is possible. We've tabled the measures at the end of 15, and we've already legislated on 85% of them. So it's working well, it's progressing well. What convinced our ministers and our political parties, so the circular economy package got very quickly the approval of our Council of Ministers, so a qualified majority of governments thought it was a really good idea. And the same in the European Parliament, and everyone's asking actually for more ambition for us to be quicker with deploying of the measures and the legislation. That was basically due to these figures that are quite positive. In terms of climate, our impact assessment shows that we could basically offset above 1% of the world's emissions in the European Union through the circular economy. So we can offset Australia's emissions yearly, basically. In terms of waste, lots of savings in terms of waste management systems, in terms of cleaning up beaches. In terms of economics, well, if we're not buying all these fossil fuels and all these raw materials from abroad, of course, this is going to help us. We won't have to buy from abroad again the materials that we have bought once, because we are going to reuse them. So that's 1 trillion a year, not sent abroad, and that's equivalent to 7% of our GDP. In terms of industry and businesses in the European Union, typically 20% of businesses' costs are labor, 40% are resources. And so it's also very interesting for our businesses and our industries. And the best thing that convinced ministers is the employment prospect, local employment at all skills levels. Lower skills levels, you have the repair shops, you have disassembly jobs, you have managing the collaborative or sharing economy, and the higher hand jobs, you have the typical green goods and services market that is booming. The European Union currently has a 30% share of that market, and really we can't afford to let that slip. And we think that the circular economy vision is going to help us develop the skills and the tools and the technologies that will be needed in the future. So the actions, the measures fall into these 4 process categories: production, consumption, waste management, and secondary raw materials. So I'll give you some examples of what we're doing in these 4 processes. And these are the 5 priority sectors that we have chosen to work on. I won't be able to present everything today, so I'll focus on plastics, because that's basically the flavor of the day, of the month. Everyone is interested about plastics at the moment. In terms of what we're doing in the production cycle, so 80% of a product's environmental impact is decided at design stage, so we really want to focus there. Our idea is to kickstart by reviewing an existing legislation, which is the one that corresponds to your GEMS, which we call the Eco-Design Directive, which is eco-design requirements for energy-using appliances. At the moment, or before we changed it, it only looked at energy efficiency minimum requirements for a product to be put on the EU market. What we've included in there is durability, minimum criteria, repairability, availability of spare parts, recyclability, easy disassemblability, if I can say that word, of the different elements, as well as making sure there's no hazardous chemicals in particular in the plastic streams of most of the elements, so that there's value in the recyclates. So we have started doing that. We've done that recently for TV screens and computer monitors. We're now doing lifts, and we're going through the products that are already part of that Eco-Design Directive, and that go under regular revision. And we're now thinking of a broader legislation that would look not only at energy-using products, but products overall, and think of the criteria that we could put into all of these horizontal product legislation, so that we would cover construction, material, furniture, cosmetics, food and drink, whatever. So that's work is being done in terms of preparing that product, horizontal product legislation. Then we also look at the process, because at the moment in European Union, you want to build a new steel plant. We have some European rules for that. It's called the Industrial Emissions Directive. And it only looks at emissions in the air, in the soil, in the water, impact on the biodiversity. It doesn't look at your waste management processes and at your resource efficiency. So we're modifying that directive as well, so that we create for each type of industry minimum criteria for the permits in terms of how these industries are managing their resources and their waste. And at the beginning, it will only apply to new permits, so new installations, but then after 5 years, it applies retroactively to all the others. So that will mean that there will be upgrades to the whole industrial stock, so to say, industrial installation stock. Now, secondary material, I've already talked a bit about it, but we talked with industrial business people about this, and what they told us is that, yeah, we're ready to do more recycled content, but we need to have trust in the recyclates. It needs to be the quality we need, and it needs to be safe, and we need scale, because if we don't have scale, it's not going to be economic for us to use that recyclate. Depending on the price of oil, we might as well use raw material again. And so the work that we're doing is look at creating standards for secondary raw materials. Specific to the material you're talking about, for plastics, for example, we feel that there's about 5 different standards that we need. That meaning that these 5 standards, once we will have them agreed with industry, because standardization organizations are controlled by industry people. Once we will have agreed them with industry, they would be able to then only use these standards in the plastic they put in a product. Hence, we would have clean recyclates with a scale that would make it economic to recuperate and then input into a production system again. Safety, we have to use our REACH, our chemical legislation, to do that, to make sure that we have a good tracing system for all the new chemicals that we put in the products. And we ban some that could end up in the wrong type of recyclates and in the wrong type of new products. And it is quite complicated because we also have to deal with the legacy issue of what's already in the scrap that we have. And so that requires a lot of research. But we've started with the European Chemical Management Agency to look at what type of tracing system we could have and what restrictions we could put in place for certain type of applications. And then we have recycled content incentives. We have not decided to legislate already and say to the plastic industry, you need to have 50% of recyclate within your products. We've started by a pledging exercise. And so industries have until the end of the month of June to come to us with a pledge in terms of recycled content. And we'll see after that whether we need to legislate at some point. But the key thing we need to manage before we legislate is to have a way of checking the recycled content of a product. And we don't have the technology yet to check how much all the data yet to check how much recycled content there is in the product. So this needs to be sorted out. We're not only focusing on materials, we're also looking at nutrients and water. So for nutrients, well, as you know, cities are aggregators of nutrients. What we need to do is actually bring back the nutrients to the farm. And one way to do that is to work on our fertilizer legislation, which we have changed. It's the table not finally legislated yet, so that we make sure that we're not inadvertently discriminating against fertilizers of organic origin, which was a little bit the case in our former legislation. So we are changing that. For water, we have table legislation for minimum reuse criteria, wastewater for groundwater recharge and for irrigation. Cyprus and Malta are already doing that in the European Union. There's no reason why the other member states couldn't do it. And one more thing that industry needs to better understand the needs for investments is more knowledge about what's available in terms of waste, secondary material flows within European Union borders. So we're setting up that electronic system so that we have a better idea of what are the existing flows of material, where's the secondary material created and where it's going. This is going to help transparency and make industry make the right decisions in terms of investment. In terms of consumption now, we made a study and realized that so-called green products attract a 20 to 25 price markup in the European Union market. Yet 90% of the time, it's either a false claim or you can't prove the environmental claim. So what we want to do is really empower the European consumers with the tools that they need to first get the spare parts and the repairs that they want to their product. So we are going to change the directive on consumer guarantees to make sure that this is the case. And we also want to create mass and individual remedies against false green claim. And we are going to change our regulation on unfair commercial practices. That's a lesson from the Dieselgate, basically. And that is something which we feel can really put the right frame of mind into producers' heads in terms of what a sustainable product really is. We also have finalized a 3-year work program on planned obsolescence with our researchers, and we're ready to set up an independent testing system. So that that's going to help the implementation of the consumer legislation, by the way, because we are able to prove that a product has been planned for stop working early on in its life. And we are changing all our labeling rules to include durability, recyclability as part of the information that's put on the product that are on European markets. And we are modernizing our eco-label system, which at the moment only look at the environmental footprint without taking into account waste management and recyclability. So that is also now part of all our labeling systems. Now, that's more for the waste management nerds than the climate crowds, but there are a few things that are interesting from the climate point of view here. In terms of waste per capita, just in the EU, we're at 450 kilograms a year. In Australia, for your information, you are 550 kilograms a year. So it's just 100 kilograms more than in the European Union. but the share of what we recycle or recover is about the same if we consider the total amount of waste, not discriminating against certain types of waste. We landfill less than in Australia, but I'll explain the graph, it's very different according to member states. We're recycling about the same, but we don't use the same metrics, so it's very difficult to compare between the European Union and Australia. Incineration is at 6% overall, but it's a lot more in municipal waste, and it's very divergent according to member states. Our key achievement so far is the drop in emissions from waste management in the European Union. That comes down to our landfill directive that prevented already since 2010 the landfilling of biodegradable material. So that's what has done the trick so far, but we can go much further. In terms of that graph, these are member states. You don't need to know exactly who's who. The colors are simple. Dark blue is landfilling. The orange is incineration, and that's recycling. And so we have about every type of profile in terms of our member states. Here we have those that landfill nearly everything. And here we have those that recycle and incinerate a lot. In terms of the climate footprint of our waste management, where we want to go at is reduce landfilling, but also reduce incineration. Plastics, for example, when they're incinerated, they release all of their emissions in one go. It's not something you want to do with plastic. And the more incineration we have, and the more incineration capacity we have, the less recycling we have, the less secondary material we use. So where we want to go, so that's Germany, that's our best pupil in the class at the moment, but there's still too much incineration. So they have close to no landfilling left. There's still too much incineration. So what we are changing is European rules for European funds. We're not helping finance any more incineration plants in the member states that have reached overcapacity or where there is not enough recycling. We agree that in some member states it's still a good idea perhaps to have a bit of incineration capacity installed, but we have a whole new system to check whether it's worth having EU funds help for that or not. And so we have to manage different situations, but for us recycling and separate sorting is number one at the moment. And then we are having a look at incineration, and in particular countries it may make sense, not everywhere. The main principles of our waste management law is, it's law that decided at European level, and then each member state goes its own way about meeting the target. So we're not very prescriptive, but we work with the same principle. And so we have the polluter pays principle, the self-sufficiency, meaning you don't export your landfill waste to another state, and the proximity principle, you don't even transport your landfill waste to the next region. Waste hierarchy, so prevention, preparing for reuse, recycling, energy recovery, and the last thing you should do is disposal. So that's about the same in every country of the world. And then we had targets for 2020, which is now, it's very soon. That's why we really needed to review our legislation. This was not giving certainty for the waste management industry anymore at all. And since 2015, we had paper, metal, plastic, and glass, separate recycling. But what we've managed to legislate that's entering into force now is to give a lot more certainty to the industry, because they have an horizon until 2035 now in terms of the recycling sorting plants that they need to install for us to be able to manage our waste. And we're adding 3 more separate collection streams: bio-waste, that's going to help emissions, the textiles, and hazardous waste for municipal. And we're having a progressive phase out of landfilling with a maximum of 10% by 2035. And finally, we're changing the rules for what we call extended producer responsibility. That's where in certain areas, such as for cars or electrical equipment, we already have legislation that makes producers responsible for organizing collection and recycling and everything. So they pay into a fund at different systems. Sometimes it's a fund where everyone pays according to their sales, and that pays for the whole environmental treatment of their waste. Now, we want to make sure that the systems now take into account the circularity of the product, so that the producers that have the best product from a circular economy point of view pay less into the scheme than the other ones. Now let's go to plastic. So at the moment we consume about 100 kgs per European per year. It's about the same in Australia, kilograms, sorry. And the share of recyclating demand is only at 6%. So that is very, very poor. We have 26 million tons of waste a year. And like Australia, we send a lot abroad. of the 50% that you see here, 85% was going to China, which is not possible anymore because China just banned the import of plastic waste unless it has very good high quality, and our sorting systems don't create that type of quality in our recyclates, so we are not able to export to China anymore, as is the case for most of Australia's plastic waste. We incinerate a lot, and one key problem is packaging. And so from the economic perspective, this single use is just a waste of money. we are investing in this product, and we're only using it once, often for a very short period of time. And then we're emitting all the emissions again through incineration or through just littering the environment. And this is not against plastic. This is against unsustainable use of plastic. It's important to point this out because the plastic industry is not all that happy about everything we've proposed, but they recognize that they can't be defined by their waste. And it's becoming a social license problem for the industry. And what we're targeting is unsustainable use of plastic, not plastic. The emission savings potential is big because the plastic industry's emissions are set to double by 2050. And recycling saves 90% of the emissions. And you really don't want to incinerate because you have emissions at the production stage, but then the emissions at the burning stage are even higher. There's 2.7 tons that are released when you burn plastic. So we need to find a more sustainable way of doing things. We also need to find a more sustainable way because of the waste problem, of course. What the Europeans tell us is 74% are worried about the impact on their health. 87% are worried on the impact on the environment. In terms of microplastic, for example, we still don't know exactly what it does to our health, but we know it's in the air we breathe, in the food we eat, and the water we drink. And that has given us the mandate to take action, because 90% of Europeans wanted something to be done on single-use plastic in particular. And so what we've targeted is the 10 most commonly found single-use plastic items on European beaches, for which there was already a available and affordable alternative. And we've tabled the ban for these applications. They are balloon plastic sticks, the steers, the straws, the cutlery, the plates, and a couple of other items. And we hope to be able to have so when we table a ban, there's a whole impact assessment that looks at the environment and the economic impact. And once this is done, probably in a year's time, we hope that this will be able to enter into force. Other actions in the plastic strategy that we've just tabled is to reach, just as Australia has just pledged through the COAG ministers press release, 100 packaging recycle or reuse by 2030 in a cost-efficient manner. This is really for us the two important words, cost-efficient manner. It means that we are going to ban those applications that can't be recycled in a cost-efficient manner. And a lot of them at the moment aren't. And so it's going to be based on a clear economic impact assessment, life cycle assessment of different types of packaging. We want to reach 50% recycling rate for all plastics. We are banning intentionally released microplastics, so that's cosmetics, detergents, paints. And we're also looking at non-intentionally released microplastics. Typically it's textiles when you wash them, tires. We're looking at what type of quality criteria for tires or textiles we can set up so that there's less shredding, less leakage into the environment. I've talked about the single-use plastic ban. We're also asking for compulsory standardized labeling for sanitizers, wet wipes, and balloons, because we don't yet have the alternatives that are affordable. And so that's why we're not banning, but we're asking for more awareness raising from these producers about the products and what should be done with the products when they're used. We're adding producer obligations for all these cigarette butts, wet wipes, etc. The producer obligations are for the producers to pay for the cost of the collecting and of the recycling of these products, as well as awareness raising measures. So we want to be able to make sure that it's not littered anymore, because there's a fund in place by the producers to make sure that we recuperate this plastic waste. We are asking for reduction targets for single-use plastic containers and drink containers. For food and for drink, that's basically to take away food. The idea is that when you go to your takeaway place, you're given an alternative to plastic, and if you want plastic, you are going to have to pay extra to get in the containers in plastic. Plastic drinks bottles, we want a 90% recycling rate by 2025, and we're also having producers pay for the cost of collecting and recycling a fishing gear, because it's 27% of marine litter in the European Union. So it's big, but at the same time, it's a very sexual thing that's quite easy to organize for the producers to take care of that. So I'll stop here just perhaps to conclude, say that it's really not an environment policy per se, it's a whole of an economy approach. But we really are optimistic because politically we have strong momentum and support from all types of parties, from all governments, and there's strong support from the base, from citizens that I think many of them say are inspired and are ready for this. Also, it's not that our current linear system is here by design or by malintent. It's just that our industrial revolution, was a bit rudimentary and brutal, and we stopped working in a circular economy, which was the case until before then. There had never been really any waste. Everything was fed another loop. We kind of broke that, and we think we can fix that. And on top of that, we feel that we can have impact beyond the European Union because of the size of our market. 500 million people, the world's largest economy. If producers start making these products for us, they might as well sell the same products outside, and we hope we can have an impact on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That was great. Do we have any questions? Oh, wow. Okay. We'll start here and we'll go around. Please introduce yourself first so we know who's speaking. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great overview. My name is Rob from Start to Sea. 2 questions, if that's allowed. Hopefully they're short. First one is circular economy in combination with the growth mantra that we still see in a lot of economies. What are your thoughts on that? And is that being addressed in the European Union? And the second question is there a link with PEF, the Product Environmental Footprint Initiative?
Yes. Yes, this has solved a political conundrum for us because we live in a bipartisan environment, and we have more and more people in the Green parties and the progressive parties that are arguing against growth, saying you can't go on as the European Union advocating growth because it's just not compatible with the sustainability of the environment. And that policy has allowed us to reconcile the growth doctors with the growth promoters for a while. I don't know, we're going to have to produce real results on this, but that is reconciling everyone behind that vision at the moment, and it has solved a political dilemma for us. Yes, the environmental footprint, product path. Footprint? So it's 5-year study that we launched on product footprints to try to have a cost-efficient way of doing life cycle analysis. At the moment, when each time we want to do a life cycle analysis of a particular product, it costs up to 25,000 euros. And we realized that if we group products by categories, had the producers around the same table and get them to discuss what are the meaningful differences that need to be analyzed, we could go down to a cost of an LCA of about €1,000 per product. And that would be really good because it allows us then to check more efficiently the green claims that are made about products, and that also allows us to easily then design green public procurement rules for certain type of products, because we would have the metrics that matter for the environmental footprint of that particular product that you want to procure. So that project has worked well. We've already looked at 200 product categories, if I remember well. And we are continuing for 1 more year, and then we'll be ready to use that information for green public procurement, for eco-label, and also for sustainable finance, because we have this sustainable finance initiative in the European Union, where we want to make sure there's no greenwashing in the finance sector, and we would want to have some metrics on products to do that.
Also, for those who are joining online, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in and we will get to you as well.
How much of, sorry, Roger from Monash University, how much of the recycling effort is at the individual level and how much of it is at the commercial and industrial level? And maybe if we just focus on plastics. Yeah.
So municipal waste is only 8% of total waste. So as a household, you only control about 8% of total waste. A lot of the waste is done by construction and demolition, but that's a sector which we target through other types of legislation. I have not mentioned here, but we're also progressing and we have specific legislation for these product streams. Does that answer your question? No.
So for lots of us, our focus is
Yeah.
on our individual behaviour, but in fact that's our individual behaviour, which is important, but in fact the focus should be on industrial, commercial.
Yes
processes.
and no, because even though it's only 8%, it's extremely visible and it's extremely costly and polluting compared to other types of waste, which are less varied, bigger economies of scale in handling them, easier to legislate on because less people involved. And so municipal waste is really the last frontier, the important one.
We're going to take an online question and then get back to the in-person audience.
Yeah, so I've got a question from Robert McLean here. Do you find these changes are driven by a genuine concern for the environment and a reduction in the use of resources, or just by brute economics?
Everything. We, in the European Commission, we work collegially as a collegial system. And this circular economy was carried by 4 different commissioners, 8 different departments. And it's got everything to suit everyone in there. And you can, if you want to see it from the economic prism, you do. If you want to see it from the environment prism, you do. And frankly, I'm not sure it really matters as long as the end result is good for the environment and for the other metrics that you have in mind. It is true that it has become more, as you could see from my presentation, as long as it was presented as an environment, as a waste problem, it didn't really fly. As soon as we presented it as a circular economy, more of a reindustrialization policy, creating local job, as well as handling the environment problem, suddenly it was more politically palatable. If that's what it takes, I mean, why not?
Hi, Aaron from DELP. In terms of implementing a circular economy, do you think the barriers are more technological or institutional?
Both. It requires a lot of standardization and regulation, because if you want to have end-of-life products of the right quality, you need to regulate so much at product design stage. And so it becomes extremely heavy in regulation, unless you get all the industries around the table and they all agree voluntarily to do what makes sense. We tend not to go that way in the European Union because we have 28 countries, different languages, a large market, and everyone feels a bit safer if everyone just has the same rules. It creates a lot more certainty and trust. Now, perhaps in Australia, you don't have to go down that road because it's a much comfy environment with less players, so to say. Technologies, yes, we do need technologies. I mentioned checking recycled content, extremely complicated thing to do. And that's one example of we need new technologies there.
Caroline, I just wondered, with the Australia starting to negotiate a free trade agreement, what's the impact of this kind of set of legislations on products that are imported and exported? How do they?
There is an impact, of course, because we legislate on product design, which is legislation that prevents products that don't meet the requirements to be imported in the European Union. Now, Australia doesn't produce a lot of products. It's a lot of agricultural products that are not yet covered. And so I don't think the impact on Australia is important from the product point of view. I think it's more interesting from the resources point of view. If other economies, we're the largest economy of the world, we're the largest fossil fuel importers, we're one of the largest materials importers. If this works out and we don't import that much, that will mean that export countries will have to adapt their economy. Bruce.
Bruce Wilson from RMIT. I was very interested in your graphic with the different performance of the different member states. And you mentioned early on that you had very strong Council of Ministers support for the decisions. Is that being followed through across all of the member states in terms of implementation? Have you got, for example, in some of the Eastern European countries, a take-up and a real kind of commitment to the implementation of this?
Oh, the legislation entered into force last month, so it's a bit early to check whether it's being implemented. The former legislation was not evenly implemented. And the laggards were not always the new member states. And it all depends, it depends a lot on the country's ability to get things done at local level. And depending on your system, you're very good at it, or you're not, or it's more of a challenge, so to say. What we've put down with this package is the countries that are more behind, like for the landfilling phase out, they have 5 more years to get there. But we've also put some money in our regional funds aside to help them invest in their waste management system. And so not only setting the objective, we don't want to set people to fail, of course, countries to not. And so the idea is that we develop a strategy together to help them get there.
Great. We'll wrap up. If you have additional questions, Caroline will stick around for a few more minutes and you can come find her.
Thank you
Thanks
very
again
much.
very much for your time. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you very much.